Thank you for attending today, our webinar on assuring a low carbon future. So as you can see, this is a roundtable event and we have some very special guests who I will be introducing shortly. We're now approaching almost 120,000 views of all of our webinars, and we hope to continue to grow. So please keep an eye on what's coming for this year. Just want to have you all a very quick date for your diary. Our next webinar is on Friday, the 28th of July at the usual time of 10 a.m. The subject will be a Space Therm Toolbox talk. So essentially, it'll be an overview of the practical applications of Space Therm, high performance range installation systems, their performance benefits, and best practice for site installations. So a very interesting one. As you know, we will try our best to answer all of your questions. We already have a number via email, which is fantastic. You can post them right here on YouTube, DM us at Proctor Group on Twitter, or email us webinar@proctorgroup.com and they will be picked up. You can direct those to a particular panel member, perhaps after I've introduced them, or we can just ask them to the general group and have them answered. Personalised CPD certification is available on our webinar page now, or after the webinar, which is www.proctorgroup.com/webinar. And if you've registered, you will receive a follow-up email with all the links and a link to the replay. So please feel free to circulate that with friends, colleagues, etc. It really helps us out if you enjoy this session to give us a thumbs up, and you can also subscribe to our YouTube channel, and that keeps you informed about anything else we have coming, be it webinars, install videos, news, etc. So I'm just going to jump right in and introduce the panels. We're hoping to finish at around 11 o'clock today. So if I could ask each of you, please, just to introduce yourself, who you are, what you do, and a really quick overview, 3-4 minutes around the headline topic today, which again is assuring a low carbon future. So perhaps I could start with you, Anne-Marie. That would be great.
Okay, great. Thanks, Keira. Okay, definitely try and keep it to 3 or 4 minutes. My name's Anne-Marie Fallon. Hi, everybody. I'm an Associate Director and Passivhaus Designer at Architype, an architectural practice based across the UK, but most recently established our Scottish office in the last 4 or 5 years in Edinburgh. I feel relatively lucky so far in my career that I've worked on probably 95% of the buildings that I've worked on have been passive house buildings. So that business as usual approach of looking at construction and design has not been part of my, I suppose, genetic makeup, as it were, so far. And I think the reason we were very excited to develop and grow in Scotland was because of the kind of slightly more ambitious climate policies and actions that had been taken in Scotland in recent years to push the low carbon and decarbonisation agenda. And I'll just say a few words about that, really. So, a couple of my own views really around what a low carbon future is. I mean, it really can't occur without an emphasis on quality and quality in how we deliver. So I know there's the climate emergency and the urgent need to decarbonise, but actually to get there, we need to have a quality-driven approach right from when someone puts pen to paper and writes a brief all the way through to the use and operation of the building. And in my view, there's still serious misconceptions about what a low-carbon future really means across the industry. Is it just offsetting? Is it just waiting for the grid to decarbonise? Can we avoid retrofitting? Do we have to really bother with high-performing buildings? There's a lot of challenges out there in the industry in terms of how people think. And it really needs to be a blended approach of course, the decarbonisation agenda and the electricity in the national grid becoming greener, but we also need to look at demand reduction. And the Climate Change Committee reports set that out very, very clearly. But interestingly, it's missing from a lot of our conversation around what net zero carbon means. We're in a very volatile market at the moment. The cost of everything goes up, has been going up. The cost of producing materials is going up because energy is costing more, because we're continuing to use a kind of fossilized base for our industry. It's a really vicious cycle, and it's a really challenging time to build anything, as I'm sure people are aware of on the call as well. And it isn't just the decarbonisation and just transitions that are happening at a macro scale that are causing that. It is the cost of energy and other things across the world at the moment. But what really interests me is the practical application of net zero carbon. How do you actually deliver a low carbon or zero carbon building? What quantitative benchmarks, if you're a client, what do you set in your brief to allow and ensure that is the product or service that you get delivered at the end of the day? How is that managed and monitored? How do we avoid a low carbon building just being a box ticking exercise that doesn't really actually have any performance benefit at all by the time we get to 2045 or 2050? So who is in charge of that, or in control of that carbon gap in building? And that's something that I'm really interested in. And again, coming back to quality, more time, more inspection, and ultimately more care about how our buildings are procured will help offset that and actually deliver genuinely zero carbon or low carbon buildings. A lot of the ambition to deliver those buildings are written down and are part of scopes and contracts, but actually the delivery of them and the journey of them can be a bit challenging. So we just need to be really mindful of that. And it's not just about operational carbon, it's about embodied carbon as well. And it's really fascinating that the BBC just picked up recently that there's only one PV recycling facility in the world in Grenoble in France at the moment, and it's only opening this June. So when we start looking at offsetting and we're putting PVs in our buildings, there's actually no end of life plan for those PV panels on a global scale yet. So that's something quite compelling that is part of the low carbon future agenda as well that we need to be mindful of. So I'm here to talk a bit about Passivhaus before I hand over to the next speaker. Passivhaus is an energy methodology to do with reducing operational carbon and operational energy. So it doesn't at the moment deal with whole life carbon or embodied carbon. However, by targeting demand reduction and looking at a seriously reduced level of operational carbon in our buildings, the whole life cumulative carbon of that building can be very seriously reduced alongside a decarbonisation strategy of the fuel source. It's a quality assured methodology. It's been proven by monitoring of buildings all over Europe and now in the UK for the last 3.5 decades, particularly in Europe, and over the last 15 years in the UK. And there isn't an energy target that's based purely on building physics in existence globally that has that legacy of proof of performance, which makes it a very compelling standard to be able to aim for. And the analogy of, if you were to buy a car that only had 50% of its checks done on the production line, would you feel safe in that car? Would you think that car's value for money? Why do we do that with buildings all the time? We procure and use buildings that really just don't satisfy all the quality assured requirements to operate and use that building, and ultimately create and add more energy demand on the grid as well. So setting an energy standard, understanding and applying what low carbon and whole life carbon really means over the lifetime of a building, and being part of that step change of industry is, I hope, what people are interested in being on the call today. And, being aware of the impact of demolition and encouraging reuse, but also understanding that, retrofit has its challenges and solutions as well. As part of that low carbon future is really important. And again, coming back to that two-prong approach of looking at demand reduction first, as well as the decarbonisation and offsetting requirements on a project is super important. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. We're very happy to have you here with your wealth of experience on this topic. Thank you. Nicola.
Yeah, so my name is Nicola Jackson. I'm an architect and I'm the Net Zero Projects Lead at Robertson. And Robertson is one of the largest family-owned construction infrastructure and support service groups in the UK. And I'm just going to pick up on a point or continue with it for what Anne-Marie was talking about around what happens to a building at the end of its life cycle. So what does happen to a building when it's no longer needed? Like it might be demolished to make way for a new building using new materials. But it would be better if that building could continue to be reused, and it might need to be repurposed to serve a new function. You might need to retrofit it to improve the energy performance. But if it does need to be taken down, then what happens to that building? Typically, materials, they end up in landfill, which is the worst case scenario. You might think about how materials can be recycled, and that's great, but actually that can be an energy intensive process and results in carbon emissions. So it would be better if those elements could actually be reused, and we should see buildings as material banks with materials that we can use in future. A good example of a building that was designed for deconstruction and reuse was a building that Robertson built for COP26. So it was an exemplar energy efficient home, and it had to be designed to be deconstructed at the end of its life because it was just there temporarily for the event. So in order to facilitate deconstruction, it was planned, which is the most important thing. And it was a series of panelized timber frame components with ease of access to fixings that allowed it to be taken apart. The primary thing is that we plan for that reuse, and we applied that methodology also to another Robertson house type. and we produced a deconstruction plan for that building and looked at what elements could be reused, and gave them a high, medium or low reuse potential as to how it could be potentially reused after a 50-year period. And we worked out that actually 95% of the timber in that building could be reused. So that's a good start, but we need to go further, basically. And we need to have that documentation in place to show what could be done with that material, like how can it be taken apart and how can it be reused. And thinking about how that data is stored, it's great to have a digital twin and all that information in one place, but will we be able to access that in future? So in summary, we need to design for disassembly to assure a low carbon future, and we need to see buildings as material banks for the future.
Thank you very much, Nicola. Will, could I come to you next, please?
Good morning, Keira. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I'm certainly very happy to be surrounded by experts on the topic matter at hand today. I'm not going to sit here and say that I'm one of those experts, but hopefully, from my background in construction for the last 20 years and the sort of focuses I have, I've always been involved in sustainability and matters at hand, such as insulation products, obviously the likes of membranes and air tightness and everything that's been around that, really. So it's all sort of played up quite a key message in my career for the last sort of 19-20 years, by default, to be honest. I started in insulation, and obviously our message is quite clear. We're offering products to the market that would improve not only the lifestyle of the people who are living in these homes with regards to comfort, but also helping reduce carbon emissions from that building, sort of always pushing that boundary as to where we take new products and product development. And that sort of led me into the role I'm in today. So I head up the business development team at the A.Proctor group here, and we have a whole host of different products and ranges which we look after. And one of the most important things that we're always talking about as a team is making sure we are at the forefront here with developing new products, and how we make sure that the new products we obviously look to bring to the market also massively has a sustainable key. It's not just about we need a new product, where's a hole in the market, let's go and sell this product. We're always looking at how we make sure that the sustainability of products is always thought about, and sort of comes now pretty much first as product development. I've also been involved with the EWI, retrofitting of especially obviously retrofitting houses. I've seen well over 1,000 houses be retrofitted to make sure they're up to a standard. The one thing that surprises me is even today that new build obviously buildings that are going up, not just houses, aren't at that net zero. My concern is always, if we're not retrofitting a new building to net zero now, are our targets sort of set right? How are we going to then look at developing those properties that have already gone through sort of changes and improvements, but aren't at that net zero standard? So are we sort of doing enough right now today to make sure that we're going to meet this target by 2050? As I said, sustainability has always been a constant for me. It's a message that has come in different guises and different offerings, not only from the companies that I've worked with, but also the government. I think the message is sometimes lost. The delivery of the message is sometimes lost. I think it's true that everybody wants change and they want to change, but it's the delivery that seems to be lacking. We know who, that's everyone. We know when, and that's now. We know what to a point. I'm not too sure that we know how we can change, how we can improve, how this will be facilitated. Hopefully we can touch on a lot of those matters today within the chat.
Thank you, Will. Last but not least, Peter.
Thanks, Keira. Morning, everyone. My name is Peter McConnachie. I'm Passivhaus manager for Robertson Construction Tayside. I've been in the construction industry all my life, working from a variety of domestic projects, commercial projects, and sustainability and reducing energy usage, something I've always been quite passionate about. I think to combat climate change, which is essentially what we're fighting, we need to have a sustainable future for the future generations, and we need to shift to a low carbon society. The UK, like many other countries, we've now signed up to these pledges for 2050, and the only way to do that is through renewable energy transitions, energy efficiency improvements across manufacturing, infrastructure, We've got a lot of technologies out there that are being adopted at the moment, but it is still lacking. We need to increase the speed that we're doing it. We need smart grid implementation, battery storage. We need to think about how we're using energy in our buildings, from lighting, heating, which is, as Anne-Marie touched on, Passivhaus. You know, that is a calculated number from the start, from the design process. So instead of building a building, then having a look at how it's used, this is all calculated well in advance, which is something that we can have on paper, and we can keep records of, we can analyse, we can use, we can improve upon. We need to look at low carbon construction methods and sustainable materials, whole life embodied carbon. We need to look at the energy use for the building, not in terms, the cost, not in terms of the cost of building these energy efficiency measures into a building, but the whole life of the building. Because quite often we focus on it costs X amount to create a project, but we don't look at over its 60-year lifespan or 70-year lifespan. Modular construction, off-site construction, these all have applications that we should be looking at developing further. As Nicola touched upon, you know, they designed the building that was to be recycled. Modular construction, I mean, if you've got a module that performs in a certain way, why can't you remove that building in 35 years' time? The module still performs in a certain way if it's constructed to the quality that Anne-Marie touched upon. You know, there is ways out there we can do it, but we need to do it as a lot faster than we are.
Thank you very much, Peter. So we already have some fantastic questions coming through, and I love it when people start answering each other on YouTube as well. So please feel free, if someone's asking something and you want to chip in and you're in the audience, go ahead. So what I'll do is I'll start directing the questions to the panel. If I ask a certain individual a question, the rest of you, to put it for want of a better word, please feel free to chip in if you have any additional thoughts or contributions that you want to make. So a very free-flowing, open roundtable today. So Will, I'll start with you just to get the ball rolling. And as I say, others feel free to comment as well. A very nice general question from Daniel Simpson on YouTube: is net zero enough?
Oh, wow. That's an ongoing debate. I think I did touch on this actually in my introduction there. I think it's an important goal. Net zero is definitely an important goal. But there has been a recent study by the Nature Climate Change that basically looked at net zero not doing enough to maybe address other issues such as gases like methane. So yeah, I'm sure other members of the panel have got a lot more to say about this than I have, but I'd certainly say no. I don't think it is enough at this stage. I think it's a great starting point, and if people, organisations, and countries have got a target to aim to, then that's fantastic, and that shouldn't be understated. But I think certainly trying to go that step further is always very important here. And I think, yeah, net zero, a great starting point. I think that's what I'd say. But I think more aggressive measures probably need to be taken in order to achieve the end goal, which is obviously trying to make sure that we are true net zero.
Good. And Anne-Marie, you talked quite a little bit about carbonisation and the difference between actually delivering that and how it's done. Would you have any comments on this topic?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important to understand what target you're aiming for. So when we talk about is net zero enough, I mean, net zero almost as a phrase has become slightly meaningless in terms of what you're actually, what you're actually aiming for. So if you're aiming for operational net zero, are you aiming for lifetime emissions net zero? And the UK Green Building Council sets out various levels and definitions of net zero really quite well. And I think until the last 5 or 6 years, local authorities, clients, generally the construction industry had no real understanding of how to deliver those definitions. I think just touching on something that Will said, and obviously Peter, that we need to be able to deliver net zero solutions. And if we are looking at the wider boundaries of what net zero is, which takes into account what Nicola was talking about in terms of like reuse, end of life, what really can happen at that end stage of a building's life, it becomes a much more significant undertaking. And I think there's very few buildings in the UK. I think there's one building in the UK at the moment that's a verified net zero in operation and embodied carbon building in London. Max Fordham's own small residential house, so very bespoke little experimental building, but is the only building in the UK at the moment that is a fully verified net zero from an embodied and operational carbon perspective. So we do have a long way to go, but I think the first step is really understanding the definition of what you're aiming for. And if you're only aiming for operational net zero, or you're only aiming towards net zero, just understanding where you're sitting in that journey is a really positive first step, you know, because there are many steps to this, and it's quite a complex information area, and there's lots of controversy out there. I mean, I mentioned the PV panels in my talk. Obviously, PV panels generate a lot of electricity and energy, you know, by virtue of their creation of energy from free, you know, solar gain. They have a significant benefit, but ultimately, coming back to what Nicola said about end of use of life of buildings, the end of use of life of PV panels is a huge carbon burp in the future or now, and that we simply just haven't dealt with. So offsetting on its own as part of net zero isn't the answer. We need to be very mindful of materiality, retrofit, you know, future use, as well as the operational demand reduction. So I think being more empowered, even if it's in one facet of knowledge in that area, is a really positive first step, and it'll help you then start to understand the bigger carbon picture.
Thank you very much. Peter and Nicola, do you have anything to add around net zero being enough for, you know, what the industry is trying to accomplish?
Yeah, I think there's quite a lot of people misunderstand the term net zero. They think it means no carbon emissions at all, but it only means we're not putting additional carbon emissions into the atmosphere. So the target of net zero really isn't enough, because the damage we've done since the start of the Industrial Revolution, you know, the carbon still there, it's going to take decades to reduce. If we can introduce carbon capture projects, or if we can bring technologies out, if we can replant in wildlife areas, you know, these can increase the carbon reduction. So if we can get any buildings, projects, things to carbon negative, that would be a better impact on the environment.
I was going to say a similar thing. Yeah, buildings should be having a positive impact on the environment. Yeah, exactly around some of the things that Peter was saying.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much. Another good question here, which I'm sure you can all contribute towards, the misconceptions of Passivhaus. Peter, maybe you could start us off being the Passivhaus manager for Robertson. I'm sure you come across these a lot in your career.
I think the most popular one is you can't open the windows because it's airtight, which isn't the case. You can open the windows. The building certainly isn't too airtight because the ventilation's controlled. A lot of people in the UK anyway, we have buildings that have ventilation, underfloor ventilation, you know, things like that, and they think the buildings need to breathe. But what a Passivhaus building does, it is breathing. It's just controlled breathing. So it reduces condensation risk. But that's probably the largest misconception, along with the expense of it. People throw numbers out, it's 40% more expensive, it's 25% more expensive. But when you put that expense against the whole life of the building, it's actually cheaper in the long run to build a Passivhaus building, both economically and environmentally.
And it's just quite interesting as well, just to add to what Peter said, on recent projects, where costs have gone up, and, you know, having close collaborative relationships with contractors is really helpful to better understand the cost mechanisms of some of these projects, whether it's retrofit or new build, where, you know, finishes, you know, just in this January, a number of finishes went up 30%. Intumescent paint and steel in particular per ton has gone up 80% since March 2020. You know, that there's a huge amount of pressure on the construction industry at the minute. And actually, it's not to do with trying to achieve an energy standard. Part of it is to do with changing over to heat pump technology. And there's huge pressure on clients to look at capacity coming into site, and the kind of national infrastructure has become a significant problem. And for example, in London, I know of several large housing and regeneration schemes that are basically being stalled by the utility providers for 3 to 5 years because they simply cannot get that capacity to that part of London quick enough. But actually, if we were designing in a super low energy, super demand reduction way, that incoming KVA capacity can drop even with the electrification of fuel going forward. So I think there's a kind of a macro balancing that's needed, you know, follow on from kind of where we were starting with this one, which is the myths of Passivhaus, that we need to be very mindful of how we diversify energy predictions as well, and how that affects the wider grid. And the power of Passivhaus is that it contributes to that overall national grid demand reduction, and this pressure to suddenly have, you know, lots of renewable energy everywhere. Actually, you know, we need to manage that with a blend of different solutions, because we don't always work at peak. You know, that peak nationally happens, well, more often than not now than in the past. But we need to be kind of a bit more rational about how we manage it.
Indeed. And what about the concept around passive house? I mean, there's a perception out there, I believe, that it's, Mr. and Mrs. Smith building their own home, passive houses for them because they want it to be passive house, super low energy. I know that Robertson, for example, have been involved in a lot of commercial projects. Is that something you tend to get involved in as well, Anne-Marie, or are you more domestic?
I'm mostly commercial and education at the moment, so the kind of non-domestic sector, and also in particular retrofit. So there's a group of 10 local authorities across Scotland at the moment that are kind of voluntarily participating in a kind of passive house shared knowledge collaborative forum network where they share experience, they're sharing information, they're sharing findings and working in a very collaborative way to better the quality gap. Because out of the back of the interest in passive house in Scotland in particular has been about quality and the fact that in educational buildings in particular, there's been catastrophic failure in construction over the last decade that had been summarised and published, I think, in 2017, 2018. The Cole report. We've obviously had Grenville, which was another kind of catastrophic regulation failure. And part of what Passive House offers is it's a mechanism within a contract to be benchmarking and monitoring quality. And say, for example, we want to monitor consistency and no gaps in insulation. Well, actually, that also applies to consistency and no gaps in fire cavity barriers and, compartmentalization of buildings in terms of a fire strategy through the building fabric. So there's a lot of really nice adjacencies, and the new compliance planning that's coming out in Scotland and the health and safety executive legislation that's coming through in England. All of that actually is reflecting a very similar methodology than what that Passive House already is implementing or asking us to implement in terms of being a bit more caring about how we're inspecting quality as we go through construction. And by inspecting quality that closely, we're delivering a better product, a product that responds better to the environmental pressures that we have at the moment, but also a very comfortable, useful building to be in and occupy, and hopefully, demythify a lot of these myths, as Peter said, is going around as well.
Good, fantastic. I have quite a. Oh, Will, sorry, did you want to add to that?
No, I was just going to add. To be fair, yeah, I think the one I was going to add, you kind of covered there, Anne-Marie, with respect to Passive House being just for houses because of its name. I mean, we've recently done the St Sibol's Point in Exeter, which was the world's first Passive House leisure centre. It's being used as a standard. I get involved in many conversations with architects with regards to using Passive House as a standard, even if they're not looking to essentially get certified and signed off at the end, which is good. I like that to a point, because it means people are thinking about it and they are wanting to sort of take it to that step, that step further than maybe they need to on a particular project. So yeah, I think one of the main things you said there also, Anne-Marie, and I think this has always been a problem in the construction industry, is as built on site, as designed. And there's still that gap between what we're designing and then what we're actually building on site and how we manage that. So I think if this is going to work, we really have to put a lot of emphasis on how we get to site, how we manage the differences that might occur. Gaps in insulation has always been an issue. And it's even more so important though when you're trying to get to that much higher standard of building. So I think that's, for me, something that we really need to focus on.
Yeah. And if people watching haven't had a look at that St Sidwell's project, which is the first Passive House leisure centre in the UK, have a look, Google it or have a look on our website. It's a really interesting project and how they delivered it. I'd recommend having a look. Nicola, I've a couple of questions that I can hopefully direct towards you. One is from Ensign Design. Is the building design profession across all disciplines capable of providing net zero designs across the board, and are clients ready to pay for the required construction and design costs?
Yeah, that's quite a long question. Yeah, in terms of cost, like as Peter was saying previously, like looking at whole life costs and how it's going to save across the lifetime of that building. And in order to save costs, you need to spend more time at the design stage in the building. Like, yes, that costs in terms of people's time, but it's going to cost you more when it ends up in site. So you have to think about how you can use less material, how you can optimize that structure. Can you switch different materials out in the building? So it's like a hierarchy of things that you need to go through to look at how you can reduce cost, and both cost and carbon should be thought of together.
Okay, fantastic. And Michael has asked, and I'll throw this one out to anyone who wants to comment. Michael's just come in saying, how is this all affordable in the private retrofit market sector?
Suppose if I kind of attempt to answer that, because at the moment very much this kind of work immediately upfront to people with interest rates and all of the other cost of living pressures that we have, plus energy costs, isn't affordable. And there's been a very but however, to counter that, over COVID, the Passivhaus Institute brought together a series of experimental DIY exercises specifically targeted at the homeowner that actually was challenging the perception that in order to get to a very low energy building or a kind of passive house retrofit level of building, that you could actually do a lot of it yourself at a much lower price point. Now, unfortunately, those really amazing guides are in German at the moment, but they were really, really compelling. And the Passivhaus Trust is doing a lot to try and translate them and get that momentum going around. Actually, if you can be informed about building physics, this isn't asking, or relying on homeowners across the country, 22 million buildings. I'm not certainly around that figure is what we're looking at. How can they better improve their buildings? And of course, the government, and there should be legislation in place to do this, because we're going to be alleviating fuel poverty at the same time. And there's members of society that maybe don't have the tools or instruments to even look at this DIY strategy or these approaches. But I think there is some exciting development in that, and it's proving that you don't need to have a contractor come in and spend $250,000 to retrofit your 1930s semi-D. We can do this in a more robust way to kind of try and address that energy gap where we can. And the most sustainable building is a retrofitted existing building. So if we can reduce the demand of that on the national infrastructure, national grid, with relatively little upfront costs, that would be amazing. And I think there's a lot of ambiguity out there for funding, particularly in the private sector. There's very little initiative to do that. The public sector are leading in a slightly better way on some of the funding initiatives at the moment, but again, as always, it's never enough to act quickly enough. So, what can we do to promote that on our own? And some of that is also where we can, not where someone's in fuel poverty, of course, as well. But, can we look at our own behavior changes? Like, again, a friend of mine has done a study of EPCs in a particular region around London. And overall, the energy use intensity of even how someone lives in a 1930s or 1920s semi-D or terraced house in London varies wildly, depending on how they behave around their perceptions of comfort. And again, that's such a variable, but I think there's a lot of education to do there. And coming back to Enzine's question as well, we need to do a lot of training and informing and educating and see how the government got the message out, for better or worse, around COVID. It needs that kind of response. We need a COBRA emergency response in terms of information, getting it out there. And I just feel sometimes that, the energy companies don't really want us to do that, do they? They want us to spend more energy. They've recorded record profits on all of the energy that we've used this year, in the last few years. And it's really challenging to get the right message out there for people to help their behavior, help themselves change and modify their own homes at a low cost, because it kind of pulls away from profits of big private companies and pension funds. And ultimately, that's what's underpinning our limitation in actually getting things done. And we just have to try and do it ourselves and inform ourselves as best we can.
Fantastic. And Peter, when it comes to the education, what kind of role do companies like Robertson play in trying to educate the sector, either locally or nationally, around the importance of these types of energy efficient buildings?
That's a good question. We've started. We perform toolbox talks to supply chain partners that come onto site. We encourage them to get training through the Built Environment Smarter Transformation Centre in Hamilton. There's a lot of online webinars through the Passivhaus Trust, the Passivhaus Institute, that they can access. A lot, I've found that just actually having conversations with the operatives on site and clients and representatives is a lot better, because once they understand it and why you're doing something, rather than just getting bombarded with information, they start to appreciate it better. There is a lot of education out there. There is a lot of it is aimed at more design stage and consultants and people in my own role, but actually explaining to the tradesmen themselves why they're doing something a certain way, that seems to be being adopted quite well on sites, and especially by clients. Like, we've just completed Riverside Primary in Perth. That's a Passivhaus school, and the teachers there, just talking to them through site visits and bringing the children on and educating them and telling them why they've got triple glazed windows, why they've got high performing walls, why they've got natural materials throughout, and they're all really buying into the idea of their Passivhaus school, and they're really buying into energy efficiency measures. And we had 2 kids come up to me talking about how they're now turning their Xbox off, they're switching their lights off, because when you explain to them that energy that they're using, is generated someplace and it's creating damage somewhere else, they're buying into it quite well. It's just re-education chats, informal chats. That's getting the message through a lot clearer than any other method.
I love that. Fantastic. And kids can talk. So if they get an idea in their head, everyone will know about it.
Yeah.
I'm just going to come back to you, Nicola, for a specific question which mentioned you. Bear with me while I find it. It was Stuart Marin had asked, you mentioned Robertson designed and constructed a house for COP26 for reuse. Has this building actually been used again, or is it sitting in a storage warehouse?
So it was deconstructed and taken apart, and there were a lot of different options for where that could go. Like, originally it was going to go to a community of houses as an affordable housing development, and that would have been the best solution for it, but it has been taken apart and taken to a college, where the plan is that they're going to use it as a learning aid, basically. So yeah, that's the status of it.
Good to hear. Thank you, Nicola. Will, Becky Hobbs had asked on YouTube, how many homes in the UK need to be brought up to regulation by 2050, and how much funding is available for that?
All of them, I think, maybe, if we can. That's got to be the answer to that. I think I know Anne-Marie said 22. I think there's nearly 27 million homes in the UK. From my research, and ideally they want to be zero carbon by 2050 in order to meet the goals that have been sort of set out. If the question is where are we today, I think that answer is unclear, unless anybody else can shed any more light on that. I don't think we know exactly how many homes and where they're at today are sort of meeting that standard already. There's around 9 billion that's sort of going into home schools and hospitals from the UK government, and there's well over 550 million which is funding over for sort of local authorities, over the 200 local authorities for England and Scotland, I believe. I'm not too sure if, I know there's a discussion over where's the rest of the money going to be made up from. Does this funding stack up? That's probably a really difficult sort of question to answer, and I certainly probably couldn't do that right now. But there are other sort of packages out there, like the Great Homes Upgrade, which aims to sort of retrofit 7 million homes by 2025, I think it is, and then there's 19 million by 2030, and that sort of offers a range of grants, loans, tax incentives for the homeowner to try and encourage people. That it's not going to. I think sometimes there's a misconception that the government will just chuck us a load of money and we'll be able to get all this done for free. No, there has to be buy-in from homeowners. There is going to need to be, where people can find it, money needs to be spent on upgrading these properties. But there certainly is, there's certainly a lot of sort of incentives and grants out there that will help support this and hopefully encourage people, because in the end, if we take aside the fact that we need to do this. We need to reduce our carbon emissions as a planet. Hopefully, it will help people financially in the long term. The idea is maybe the bills will come down. So yeah, hopefully that's answered that question.
It does, and I think Michael Stripling's made a very good point on the YouTube feed. For the average homeowner, they're completing priorities for the budgets available that don't lean more to environmentalism than comfort and image. So I think it's, maybe Anne-Marie can comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think people will happily spend 30 grand on a new kitchen of a certain income level, of course, rather than think about spending that money invisibly in their building for kind of comfort or energy reasons. So, like, I absolutely agree, and also other competing tensions, i.e., can I afford to pay my mortgage and my bills at the end of the month? So we're dealing with a huge pendulum of people's own personal pressures. I suppose the types of intervention that the Institute were talking about were some quite clever films on glazing, or, you know, just addressing air tightness. So we've been looking at non-domestic retrofit studies where the impact of just addressing air tightness in buildings, whilst also making sure buildings are well ventilated, is quite significant on energy cost reduction, you know, up to 30% just on its own before you even have to start any of the other disruptive stuff. So again, I think it's about being more informed, and you know, the younger generation, I do a little bit of university teaching, and there's far more, there's far more awareness about what they're doing, you know, what kind of fashion they're into, how they perceive, how they are perceiving their own energy use or resourcefulness around the bigger, wider carbon picture, as well as them having a lot of anxiety around it. In comparison to kind of older generations who, you know, behavior change has been driven by really high energy bills where they can, but that the lack of education of maybe how to do that, as well as the lack of funding, maybe, or accessible funding, because it's great. Like I agree with Will, there's this it's not imaginary, it has been committed to this funding, but actually how do people access it? How do they move forward with it? There was an article during the week about how there's been such a poor uptake and how the UK is actually so behind where it's set its alleged targets. And I think, how can targets be consistent over a 20-year period when you have governments changing and politics and policies changing all the time? I mean, last year, I think we had 4 or 5 different heads of the energy department in the UK within 4 or 5 months, with all the prime ministers changing. And not to be getting political, because we want to avoid that here, but the messaging and the support then for the person on the ground is a real challenge. And yeah, I don't have an answer to that, only that I think our perception of value and then our affordability of being able to get to whatever that value system is for the individual is part of the challenge, I think, to get to that. And we could, you know, another school of thought is that we just wait for the whole grid to decarbonize. But with the advent of, you know, the electric car charging, the microgeneration that is going in on the national grid, and the fact that costs are going to go up if we don't look at demand reduction. So Renfrewshire Council in Scotland set a tender last year to look at retrofitting 3,000 of their public sector buildings, housing, it's not private sector, because they are really worried about the increase in fuel poverty as we push towards decarbonisation and switching to heat pump technology. Current energy costs will go up even more just by changing the fuel on its own and not addressing some of the fabric issues. So we're kind of walking into other problems, especially for those at the fuel poverty level in society, that also needs to be addressed and supported somehow through some healthy retrofit. And funded retrofit, preferably, obviously, as you've said.
Indeed. Via email, Julie Rose Lever, I think I've got that right, has asked, Nicola, perhaps I can come to you as the net zero manager. How can we accelerate the transition to net zero?
Yeah, if we want to get there faster, then it is about working together and sharing knowledge and the best solutions to get there. It might not be about creating something new in a completely different way of doing something. It might be about innovating around what we've already got, like how can we make those incremental improvements. And it's also about having the right data and analysing that so we can show where we can make the most significant improvements to accelerate it.
So when you talk about sharing knowledge, how do we do that? How do you do that, your company or as an industry? How can we do that better?
Yeah, so Anne-Marie gave a really good example there of like local authorities sharing knowledge around like Passivhaus. We're a part of a group like Offsite Solutions Scotland, where we're a group of offsite manufacturers coming together to share knowledge how we can increase the use of offsite construction, and that can address issues around delivering quality and assuring you get the insulation in the building to the right density and the right volume, etc. Yeah, there's like various groups going on, and there's a group like Hub North as well, and we're coming together with different stakeholders to share like how we're getting to net zero as businesses and how we're working with different clients to meet various targets.
Okay. Thank you for sharing that. I have a fairly long one via email, Will, which I'm going to direct to you, so if you can listen closely, bear with me here. I did have it. Sorry about this. Okay, I will come back to that one. I can't locate it now. just bear with me. I must have deleted it by accident. Okay, let's move on. Apologies. Okay, on the YouTube feed, Ensign Design has asked, what's the panel's opinion? So please feel free, anyone, to come in on the potential for the lesser retrofit level under PAS 2035. Does anyone have any experience with PAS 2035?
I think the fact that there has been a methodology set and an identified person who would oversee a retrofit strategy from kind of design through to delivery is all very positive. I do know there's a little bit of kind of concern from different parts of the industry just about how PAS 2035 is developed, and kind of oversight of certain decision making. That, again, as we've heard from Nicola and others, there's kind of wider implications of why we might deep retrofit a building that probably need to be challenged first, you know, in terms of the suitability of that building going forward, the disruption that those series of buildings, particularly just in the domestic context, what that might cause. But there's also other really positive, starting to be kind of quite positive outcomes from the PAS 2035 standard, as well as a methodology. And I think Passivhaus also has a retrofit methodology. And I think if there's a methodology that's based on building physics and kind of sensible approach to design, you know, like not over insulating without thinking of the ventilation, not putting in insulation and not addressing air tightness, which will create mold and condensation risk issues in buildings and ultimately affect occupant health. We need to be very informed about those, regardless of what standard of retrofit we're aiming for, so that the building is left in a healthy state in the end. And in the non-commercial, in the non-domestic market, clients have serious challenges as well around, you know, trying to decant a school to deep retrofit it, or the suitability of schools. So, you know, the controversy at the moment around the 600 buildings in England that are made of the autoclaved concrete that's coming to the end of its life, the educational buildings down south. Can you really retrofit a building where the structure is failing? And, you know, is there a way of maybe repatriating that structure or reusing it, you know, even to a lesser grade at the end of its life? And those kind of conversations, whilst a new build might sit alongside, should really inform part of that methodology as well.
Thank you very much. Some great comments coming through on the YouTube feed. But first of all, I have managed to locate that question for Will, which was from Claire Solomon. I know the building regs are due to change in this regard, but I currently find that the targets set, such as for U values, often don't align with feasible options for the client. For example, on a narrow site where you'd like to use more sustainable materials, but the thermal targets force you to use PIR products as you can't achieve the regulation targets within the site constraints. There doesn't seem to be an option for negotiating this on a case-by-case basis unless you're retrofitting. Well, have you got any comments on that?
Yeah, obviously, it kind of ties a little bit into the discussion, the question previously on PAS 2035. I know that's more focused on the retrofit side of it, but we do come up against some very, very tricky, hard to treat areas, especially when it comes to insulation, where simply we just don't have the ability to achieve the requirements. There is the ability to obviously look at potentially the limiting values, especially for new build. And I know sometimes they can't be achieved, but that really, the onus there has to be on the design for a new build, you know. I'm trying to understand why you sort of get to a situation on a new build project where you haven't taken into account the space required to insulate to the correct levels. I totally understand on retrofit, because that wasn't the design back then, and these properties can be, you know, well over 100 years old. There are solutions in the market. There are such as aerogels would be a potential solution where you're looking to try and achieve at least some performance in an area. I'm not saying that's going to come along and achieve the exact performance required, but it's certainly a thin insulation type material, sort of 5-10 mil thick, which is going to achieve something. And I think the focus has to be on something is better than nothing. So just leaving it because we can't achieve a particular target or U value is just not good enough. There has to be more thought into what can be done and the best method or best products that can be used in that application. I'd certainly suggest that not to be a pusher at all, so apologies if it comes across like that, but it is the sort of thing we can help with. If you've got a hard to treat area, then certainly speak to us. We have a technical team dedicated to looking at potential solutions. Can't promise we're going to overcome conversations with the local authority, but we certainly can help sort of give solutions to particular troublesome areas and hard to treat areas.
Thank you very much. A bit of discussion going on here with a few people around the CCC's current statement. And Sean Barkley was asking, does anyone know, and again, Philip Jordan has come back saying where to find some of this information in the EIBI Energy and Buildings Industry magazine. So thank you for that, Philip. Does anyone know where the UK in terms of our road to net zero compared to other countries? Do we know where we are on the map with that, what we're achieving?
I mean, I would just refer back to the report that came out during the week that, you know, when we looked at in comparison with countries across Europe, that we're not really in the top end of the list. I don't feel I can qualify talking about it in more detail than that, but I think there's a universal challenge going on for all countries as to how they're decarbonising, the speed they're doing it at, and again, there's been, I think, kind of there's been issues in the UK that have stopped that acceleration in comparison to some other countries, and other countries are just a little bit more ahead maybe in terms of how informed they are. But yeah, beyond being a CCC expert myself, I think it's the dissemination of that, as in how does that apply then to various departments, various policies and strategies that then can be rolled out. And I think that's where we're getting stuck a little bit, and I think there's a confusion or indecision in how different agendas are working at a kind of, you know, high energy policy level as well. Like we have several policies going towards heat networks, decarbonisation of buildings, various funding streams, requirements in Scotland in particular to create 20-year plans by local authorities to establish and roll out heat network, low carbon heating. But that doesn't talk to the heat and building standards. You know, we have net zero carbon standards coming out in England and Scotland that are actually slightly nuanced and different. And we just don't have a common approach. We have a common ambition, but the common approach can kind of dilute the actual delivery of some of these ambitions and create a bit of confusion. So I think there's that stops any policy trying to get down to the ground level, as well as the funding or allocation of funding or incentive to be able to do that.
I think that's very well put in terms of the common ambition and not a common approach. Nicola, did you have something that you wanted to add there?
Yeah, sure. Something that I think other countries are doing better on is like measuring embodied carbon. I know we're having to do that because some clients are asking for it, or it revolves around certain funding, but other countries, they have to start measuring embodied carbon in the buildings, and then they're starting to set targets based on that. And in some places, they have to already have a deconstruction plan in place. Yeah, there's aspects that other countries are doing better than us at the moment, for sure.
Okay, and Nicola, would you have any feel on the position of the building warranty providers regarding reuse of materials in pursuit?
Yeah, exactly, because they've only got a limited time on them. But like a building could actually get deconstructed before those materials at their end of their life, but then it depends how the building's been detailed and whether there's been any damage, for example, through moisture. So there's a lot of things that need to be considered if they're going to be reused. Yeah,
a good example of that recently that we've had is our Harris Academy Passivhaus Secondary School in London, where there was ambitions to design for deconstruction. So the buildings mainly CLT panels with some concrete in situ, unfortunately because of the sloped kind of difficult nature of the site. But through the manufacturing of those CLT panels, and from what my understanding was of the fixings that were used to bring panels together, that created a kind of wastage percentage on those panels to be reused again due to the nature of fixings. And I know, Nicola, you explored this, or Robertson explored this as part of COP26. You know, there's challenges where we are trying to design for deconstruction because the market isn't ready, and also the re-warrantying of materials. So there was I can't remember the name of it now, apologies, but a significant site over a Crossrail station in London that essentially had all its steel deconstructed and brought to another site it was a demolished building, but the steel was taken out, reused, strength tested, re-warranted, suitable for use. And of course, that's really not the norm in the industry. So, you know, people are nervous, engineers are nervous to commit a new warranty to that. You know, manufacturers aren't really supporting that initiative either. So we talk about green steel, but actually we have no idea how green that steel is. Even the Steel Construction Institute can't stand over the supply chain development of where steel comes from. And actually we have huge potential to recycle, say, steel as an example, but we need to improve on the confidence levels of what those retests are, how we can encourage that reuse, because, you know, absolutely agree with Nicola. If we could look at a building like a repository for the future, that we just kind of take pieces of that building out to reassemble or refurbish and use elsewhere, that's quite a powerful way of not using all the resources. And I just see Toby in the chat has mentioned, yeah, of course we're consuming too much. You know, should we really stop building new buildings? You know, there's huge trains of thought out there about how we can stop this temperature rise and encourage kind of the carbon emission drop that we need. But, you know, we don't see a common approach globally to tackle that, you know, like we did with COVID. You know, not that I want to keep going on about COVID, but, you know, there was it was kind of mind-blowing how a relatively unified approach, for all its flaws and for, you know, all the other difficulties and tragedies that happened, we got a common approach, people got vaccinated, things happened. And 3 or 4 years on, we're in a different position, probably waiting for the next viral outbreak. But we managed to create huge change in a short space of time, and we know that can happen. But the drivers don't seem to be there at that policy level to really allow that happen quickly.
Yeah, I think a good example of where materials are being reused is to make like CLT panels, so reclaiming timber from other projects to make that. But an important part of that is like standardizing those materials. Like when we analysed our Robertson house type, every single panel in the building was different, and there's different sizes between like the ground and first floor. So it would be better and easier to reuse if those parts were standardized. And then in terms of like other elements of the building and how they're reused, it's like having a regular maintenance program and things aren't getting damaged within the building to assure that it could be reused in the future.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Peter, I have an interesting question here from Toby Ware on YouTube. A general one here. Aren't we just consuming too much? What compromises should we be considering in our daily lives to give us a chance of a genuine sustainable future? Any ideas?
I mean, you see things on the TV all the time about fast fashion. You see how people are having their vehicles for 3 to 5 years now. Yeah, we are possibly consuming too much, but that's the society we are. We do consume. Society is designed to consume, whether it's food products, clothing, entertainment. You know, that's essentially what our society is built upon. There are more and more initiatives locally for sustainability. You have food hubs, you have food sharing. So if people are growing food rather than wasting it and it going to landfill, they're giving it to a local food bank to be distributed between people. Yeah, I would have to agree. We are probably using far too much. We're using too much of our natural resources, fossil fuels. But until we can get more sustainable options, which are being developed, that's unfortunately where we are. We're now at the point in our lives and in society that we realise that we're using too much. So we are tackling it. It's better late than never. People can reduce their waste. People can reduce their consumption. People are starting to. So I think we're at the beginning of seeing a societal change.
Comes back to that behavioural change, you know, about people might want to invest in their kitchen rather than in insulation, or, you know, the interesting debate that got brought up about someone saying, well, I don't want to get my new electric car yet because I'm going to keep driving my 20-year-old one around because of the embodied carbon impact. And, you know, it's actually the creation of all these new electric cars and lithium batteries then creating another issue that has a climate impact later on. I mean, there's so much debate, and again, a kind of a lack of maybe a kind of a real holistic consensus on approach on some of these things that do make it really really hard. But again, it comes down to kind of behavior change and desire to want to do something, or as Will said earlier, you know, people do want to change, but then we don't want to change our behavior. So how do we, you know, there's a huge education around that, and not just the technical side of net zero, but actually low carbon future is so much wider than buildings, you know, as I'm sure everyone appreciates on the call. And how we start trying to triage tackling it. All industries are trying their best on their own, but, you know, there's a kind of a lack of a common approach about how we change behavior to allow that to happen holistically. Coming back to the, you know, get your jab, save lives kind of three sentence mantra through COVID. We almost need something distilled as that for the normal person to be able to try and make change themselves.
Absolutely. And Ensign Design agreed with you. The Cobra COVID response idea should be pushed by representative bodies. So let's start work on that, see what happens. And I think it's interesting today, just as we're coming to a close, how much of the conversation, it's been very technically good, but a lot of it is focused around the behaviours and the understanding of people in the industry, or in the country, in the world, and around how, I guess, there's part of it taking responsibility for our own behaviours and educating ourselves, and then of course people with that knowledge educating others is going to become more and more important as time goes on to achieve what we need to achieve in terms of the carbon emission reductions, etc. An awful lot to think about. So I would like to thank you all for attending. It's been extremely informative. Does anyone have any parting comments or anything they'd like to share with the audience before we close up for the day? You've spoken enough. That's absolutely wonderful. Well, I would like to thank all of the panelists for taking time out of their working day on this lovely Friday to come and talk to the Proctor Group and to our webinar attendees. And thank you all for attending. I hope you find it as informative as I did. And as I said, date for your diary, our next webinar, if I can find my sheet here, is Friday the 28th of July, usual time of 10 a.m. And that will be all around space therm, which is actually, it's a very interesting product. It's an extremely thin and high performing insulation product, generally used in retrofit, but it can be used in new build construction as well. So that will be looking at the practical applications of the product, high performance aerogel insulation systems in general, the performance benefits, and best practice for site installations. It really helps us if you enjoyed today to give it a thumbs up, which is a button somewhere on YouTube that you'll see in front of your screen, and go onto our page on YouTube and subscribe to our webinars, and that way you'll be informed of anything else we're doing that we're not necessarily advertising as widely. If you go to our webinar page on our website, you can download your personalised CPD certification there and find details if you want to book a meeting, if you want to have a discussion, if you have any comments. The last thing you will receive is an email with a link to a replay, and there is a link to a survey there. Please fill it out, be honest. We do read the comments, I read them all personally, and we use them to kind of shape any future webinars or roundtables. So if you have any ideas for topics, you'd like to pass a message to the panelists, then please feel free to fill out and do that. So other than that, have a lovely weekend, and we hope to see you next month on the 28th. Thank you all again.